Okay. Welcome to Race and Faith, Holy Imagination, Becoming an Anti-Racist Church, presented by Rhonda Hill and Reverend Carrie Parker. I am Rhonda Hill, the founder of Race and Faith. Race and Faith started in 2014, and our goal is to provide anti-racist education that allows space for faith to be a part of the conversation. And joining me is the Reverend Carrie Parker. Carrie, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I am the executive director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches. We connect 21 Christian traditions across the state of Wisconsin and a variety of faith-based organizations. And our work is animated by values of courage, justice, and holy imagination. Race and Faith is one of our associate members, and I am delighted to be working with Rhonda on this series on something that matters so much in all of the work that we do in the church.
Yes, I'm delighted to do this with you. And as you can see, here's our information. At any time, if you want to have further conversation, feel free to email either one of us. Please do like Race and Faith on Facebook. We have a book club called the Race and Faith Book Club. It's a group. Feel free to join that. Also, make sure you go and like Wisconsin Council of Churches. Carrie?
So we have several goals for this series. First of all, we are hoping to develop people of faith who are willing and able to engage as whole people of God. That means heart, soul, mind, and strength in conversations about racism and anti-racism. And then our second and third goals are really connected. First of all, we want to deconstruct white supremacist understandings that are embedded throughout United States Christian church systems. Once we deconstruct something, that's not enough. We also need to construct something new. And so we want to give folks tools to begin constructing new anti-racist systems. And then, of course, goals for the series, and then every session will have its own goals. Tonight, we'll provide a roadmap for the whole series. We'll familiarize you with the Race and Faith process. We'll introduce our core scripture passage, and we'll invite you to become part of the anti-racist church.
Yes. And to do that, we want to invite you to consider these guidelines for conversations. If you are doing this series with others, perhaps a part of your conversation, or if you decided, hey, I'm just going to do this on my own. Either way, consider these. The first one is stay present and engage. So if you need to take notes along the way, we encourage you to do so. That means have a notebook, pen, that you can write down any questions that may come up for you as you experience this information. We also want to remind you that this is a safe space and a brave space. And so when I speak about safe space, in this instance, I'm really speaking to those people of color who may come to this conversation and have experienced multiple conversations about racism within groups, but haven't always felt it to be a safe space. When you're engaging with our content, we want to affirm you and your personhood, also remind you that you are a child of God, and we see that and we value that. And so you are safe. And if you're doing this with congregation members, that's also stress that this needs to be a safe space, especially for those people of color, especially those that may be with a predominantly white audience. And so for white folks, we really like to emphasize the brave space piece, which is to encourage you to speak up. That's part of staying present and engaged with this information. Oftentimes, in conversations where it is mixed race, it tends to be more people of color putting their heart out there and there are situations and experiences of racism out there, while white people tend to just absorb all that information and not share. So we're encouraging you as a white person to actually to speak up, get engaged, let your emotions, let your all of who you are become a part of this conversation today. And so with that, Carrie, we'll talk about speaking your truth.
Right. So while you're engaged and present and speaking, make sure it's your truth that you're speaking. So use I statements, not you statements. And if you're going to share an anecdote or an experience, make sure it's your experience, not someone else's, your brother's, sister's, father-in-law's, whatever. Your own experience is what matters here. And that's what's really important to share and bring to the table.
Yeah. And so with that, you don't have to hurry the process. Be willing to stay and sit with the discomfort and find that you may not have closure at the end of this session. And that's okay. Again, that's part of taking notes and coming with that pen and paper and staying engaged, and stay humble. We don't know it all. We don't know all that there is or ever will be to know. So come to this with a humble heart and an openness to learn something that maybe you didn't know before, and to be challenged in ways that you probably maybe didn't allow yourself to be challenged before.
And so the last statement on this slide is be gracious. Sometimes we take that for granted, that word grace, when we're doing churchy stuff. And I think this is a really important reminder when we're doing work like this. If we're pushing ourselves and inviting each other to take risks and get engaged in difficult work, we're going to stumble, we're going to make mistakes. So be gracious with yourself and be gracious with your neighbor. Hold one another accountable, but be gracious about it.
Yeah, thank you. We want to introduce you now to the race and faith framework, how we think about this work. We're grounded in this scripture. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind and with all your strength. We figure if Jesus brought this to us as a roadmap to love God with our whole person, that we should take that same information and apply it to the way we stand against racial oppression with all of who we are. And so we like to say we're more than our minds. We understand that people have multiple entry points into this conversation about race, and we want to look at those points. Well, we often like to remind people that people are not racist just because they're ignorant. There are a lot of very smart people who are very racist. So we tend to treat racism in that fashion. Oh, this only ignorant people are racist. If they just wanted to learn some more things, they wouldn't be racist anymore. That's just not true. Racism is not happening just because there's a lack of education. It's more than that. And we have to engage it with our heart, our soul, our mind, and with our actions. And we use that with strength, with looking at actions in our body. And so when we talk about our heart, we talk about our emotional space. How are we taking in this information about racism, and where is it hitting us in our heart? What are we feeling about this? What's coming up for us? And when we talk about soul, we think about that really as our faith, our ethics, or that place where we make moral judgment. We understand that everybody come from different understandings, and especially different Christian understandings, and that's okay. But we all have something that is guiding us, and we want to pay attention to that. We have a mind, right? We have our thoughts, it's our intellect. That's where we may have questions and things that arise, where we tend to feed ourselves more knowledge. And then strength is what we tend to do with our bodies as it pertains to this information about racism. So whether you're the person that wants to get right out there and get into it and you're on the front line, or perhaps you are a person who can really pay attention and you feel manifestations in your body, I encourage people along the way to say, how is this conversation then showing up in my body. For me, oftentimes when I'm encountering this topic and conversations like this, I tend to tense up in my shoulders. And so we just ask you to pay attention to where is this showing up in your body, because that might be a sign. But all of that, that's us engaging as a whole person. So we're going to do a little example here, and I encourage you to just chime in, put it in the chat box. Any comments and such that you may have along the way. We definitely want to engage with you as much as possible. And I want you to engage in this next exercise. So let's say you are out to dinner, you and your family at a nice restaurant. While you are enjoying your meal, a fight breaks out. Now, when this fight breaks out, you have a response. Are you a heart person that you immediately, when you see the fight, you get anxious, you tense up, you're afraid, or you get worried, you go to that emotional space, maybe you pass some care on for the person who, with something like, "Ooh, I hope no one's hurt." Are you a soul person? Are you seeing this fight break out and casting judgment? Who raised them? Don't they know better? Don't they see their kids in this restaurant? That's where we would say you're going into that, your ethic, your moral space. A mind person may see that and start asking questions like, where is the manager? Who started the fight? I wonder if they were arguing before they got here. Those types of things. If you are a strength person, a person who likes to take action, you may decide to get up and go get the manager. You may decide to go and break up the fight, or you may just like, hey, I'm running, I'm getting the heck out of here. So what person are you? How do you enter into this situation? Take a moment, jot that down. If you're with us here, put it in the chat box. Where do you see yourself jumping in? Carrie, if you wouldn't mind, where did you jump in? What first got triggered for you? Your heart, your soul, your mind, or
Ooh, I am, if I'm in a sit down restaurant, I am almost definitely that emotion person. You know, I really registered with you when you said like you feel yourself tense up, right? But I can say I've actually been in a food court when a fight has broken out. And as it turned out, I had the emotion and the action at the same time.
okay.
I jumped up and fled. But there was
Okay.
something of that social situation like in the food court that allows it where you're in a sit down restaurant. It's like, oh, I'm gonna sit here and I'm gonna feel horrible.
Right. Well, and we remind people to take note, because that's really often how you encounter this information about racism. You're going to come at it from one of these four aspects, and maybe sometimes two. And our encouragement and or challenge to you is to go to all four of these places, because we believe that once we really engage heart, soul, mind, strength, we're engaging as a whole person. And that's when we're going to really get to that place of real change. And so you will experience this with us from time to time, where we'll pause and do what we like to call a quadrant temperature check. And we'll ask you to share, well, what's most alive for you right now? Paying attention to what may be going on in your heart, your soul, your mind, and in your body, and what this may be asking of you to go and do. And so if you lean into it and you start off at that soul space where your religious teachings are really becoming inspired, or some more moral judgment is starting to come out, that's fine. Go there, but then challenge yourself to go to the heart space. Or maybe you come into the experience at the heart space, challenge yourself to go to your mind and start asking some questions. Okay. So we just want to encourage you to lean in as much as possible with your whole self and with all of who you are. And with that, we're going to move into to definitions, and we like to review terms as we get started because we want us all to be on the same page. A lot of times when you see these terms that we'll share tonight, people have a lot of their own definitions for it, and that's fine. We want you to understand our definition and how we see the information, that we can all be on the same page. You may agree with our definitions and you may not, and that's fine. You don't have to completely agree, but at least we're talking from the same space.
And we'll have a few new definitions each time as well.
Exactly. So Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, our first term tonight is racism, which feels really basic, but we got to start with the basics. This is a combination of prejudice, privilege, and power. To exact racism, one must have social power or privilege based on one's race, thereby being able to use that social power and privilege to further marginalize an individual or a group without that social privilege or power. Then that becomes a system of institutional and systemic oppression. And I am guessing, Rhonda, that you have an example ready for me.
Yeah, the first example that comes to my mind is an experience one of my colleagues of color had. She was pastoring a predominantly white congregation. And when she would preach on Sundays, they would give her a hard time. This one particular Sunday, someone said to her, I can't see you because you blend in with the black back paneling. That is clearly an example of someone being prejudiced, and this in this situation being predominantly white. Yes, they have the power, but they also are the congregant who's voting her in and who also vote her out. And so they're basically telling her she's the wrong skin color. She's too dark. And in that instance, you may say, well, how does that turn into a whole policy? That could probably, even unbeknownst to them, will start determining who their next pastor will be. So now next time they say, oh, we tried a black pastor before and quote unquote, we couldn't see her. So we think we want to go with someone lighter next time, which would mean whiter. Continuing and creating a system and an institution that's still only valuing white people and giving them the power and the space and the privilege to continue to preach the gospel and make a living. So with that, we want to go to structural racism. And that is the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. Carrie, what you got?
So this experience comes from when I was a local church pastor. And one of the things that I had to do was find bulletin covers to photocopy the holiday bulletins onto. So Christmas time comes along, what pretty outside is going to be on the Christmas Eve program. And, you know, lots of flowers, lots of candles, lots of gorgeous art pieces of the Holy Family, most of them with a Euro-American. So you've got the European fine art portraits of the Holy Family. Page after page after page after page of European fine art version of the Holy Family. And at this point in time, one of my commitments was to ensure that in our predominantly white congregation, that the families with children of color and the visitors who might walk in the door would be able to see themselves represented. And all of the children in the congregation would be able to perceive the Holy Family represented as not just white, but as brown, as any culture around the world. There are so many representations of the Holy Family from art around the world. Why did we have to pick only from the white European fine art Holy Families? I think I went through 6 catalogs trying to find it. And if I hadn't been that committed, I might have given up. Publishers make a lot of money off of white Jesus. So structural racism, publishers are making lots of money. Rhonda, you're muted at the moment.
You want to read our next term, anti-racism?
I can do that. Anti-racism is defined as the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. Anti-racism tends to be an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. So what you got?
Yeah, I'm just gonna piggyback that example you just gave. This would be where a person, a pastor or committee could decide to take on the printing company that develops their resources for VBS, Vacation Bible School, and or Sunday school curricula, and demand that they create print that's more racially diverse and more historically accurate in representations of what Jesus and other Bible figures look like. So this will be a really good place that an individual could begin to take on, but it can become bigger by bringing in other people and creating a movement to really change this structure, this particular thing, a part of the structure that continues to reproduce images, stories, videos, programs in the likeness of whites, which obviously continues to aid the system of white supremacy. And this action of saying, nope, we want our print materials to be more reflective of racial diversity is one way you can demonstrate anti-racist action. And that leads us to this next term of being an actor, because we have a lot of actors in the anti-racist space. Actors, those who are not yet committed to anti-racism, but want to be seen as informed. Their actions are performative and don't challenge the status quo of racism. They are complicit in racial structures.
Ooh, I have an example. Sometimes people talk about it as slacktivism. Social media postings that aren't complemented with other types of action. So folks who are all about sharing the outrage, but don't do anything with it, are really good about putting up posts, but don't follow up.
Yes.
And then we get to move further on the spectrum here to an ally. An ally would be anyone from a dominant or majority group that's working toward ending oppression by supporting and advocating for those in marginalized and oppressed groups. So can we have an example of an ally?
Yes, I would definitely say an ally would be that person. Let's say the pastor shares to the congregation they're really disturbed about the print that's been used in VBS, in Sunday school, and in adult studies. And they really would like for other folks to come alongside and help them to do something different. So allies to this pastor would come along and say, you know what, pastor, I support you and I want to join you in this fight. So it's a person or groups of people who will be willing to say, yes, I'm willing to join in if this requires me to put in money, this requires me to put in time, this requires me perhaps to start a writing campaign or go out and get signatures to present to this publishing company. I'm willing to do that. This person or people are also willing to have the difficult conversations with perhaps some other congregation members who would say, well, we've always done it like this. We've used this company for the last 50 years. Or why do we need to change? This ally person will come along and explain and take out the time and express that it's very important for us in God's diverse world to represent those and the truth more accurately, which means minimizing how much we put out images of white people and say, no, we have to express more racial diversity and put more truth into represent who Jesus really looks like. That would be an ally. And from allyship, we move towards being an accomplice. An accomplice is that person willing to take a risk. An accomplice uses the power and privilege they have to challenge the status quo, endangering their physical and social well-being.
So the example of an accomplice I have is actually from the civil rights movement. I went to an event in Memphis several years ago, and it was at St. Mary's Episcopal Cathedral. And when I was there, I learned the story of the dean of the cathedral, who, when the clergy folks were gathering there after Dr. King's assassination, picked up the processional cross from the cathedral and took it to lead the march from the cathedral to the seat of government with the sanitation workers strike to demand justice. And with that action, he outraged a lot of his parishioners. And something like 50% of the congregation ended up resigning its membership. And in the long run, he lost his job. So there was a lot at stake there for him. And in the moment, he didn't hesitate. So let's take one step further here and talk about abolitionists. Abolitionists are those who work for the elimination of laws, systems, institutions, or practices that oppress. Rhonda.
Yes, ma'am.
Talk about abolitionists.
Yeah, and I see this really as the intersectionality. So the example you gave, it would be that person going to the next level and fighting all forms of oppression, because they begin to see that if I begin to attack poverty, I have to attack racism. I have to get at issues of sexuality, and I have to get at then issues of patriarchy. So they begin to see this intertwining system of oppression, and they work for the elimination of all of it. So some people have even been looking at criminal justice systems today, and especially here in the United States, and they're calling for the abolition of jails and prisons and saying we just need to throw the whole system away and start afresh. And so this is how I see abolitionists. We may start at one space, but we see the connectedness of all these other systems of oppression and align ourselves with, even though you can't fight every fight, but you position yourself in your heart and understand that when you're representing one cause, that is for the greater good of all the causes, that again gets at eliminating the main system that's at work and behind all of it, especially when you speak of the United States, which is protecting white supremacy.
Mhm.
So thank you for this journey. And again, I've mentioned and said, these are how we define it. You may have your own definitions. You may see it a different way, and that's okay. But we encourage you. You heard our examples. Perhaps you have your own examples. Think about what each of these terms mean for you and how you have seen them expressed. And with that, we're going to watch a video that takes us deeper into our conversation today. We are looking at the ways we become an anti-racist church. And so as part of that, we're working with not only giving you these definitions, but I'm helping you see some ways in which the church has been racist and has centered white supremacy. And this next video gives some examples to really help you wrestle with that. And as you listen to this video, I encourage you take notes, and perhaps you may become aware of instances in your own congregation where whiteness has been made front and center.
I think people are pretty clear on that that's a deficit in mainline churches, is their racial homogeneity. I think people pretty much get that these days, but they don't really have any kind of understanding of, well, what did we do? What is it about us that has created that problem, or has created this kind of diminishment of what we say we are. We say we're welcoming. We say we're inclusive. We say we're a place that all people can come and come as you are, and so I think for us, Eucharist so invokes that rhetoric that it was just a way to kind of create a template, a container for the conversation. But we could have chosen a lot of things, about the life of the church. The Eucharist just felt like a really rich kind of container for it.
Well, I wrote a book on an interracial church. I did an ethnography there, and I started about 14 years ago. I wanted to discern, what are the ways of thinking and the insights, and what has made this kind of church happen. And it was very disclosive for me, because I discovered my own prejudices. And I discovered what I ended up writing about as this sort of disconnect between what we say we believe and what our bodies think or feel, or the way who we're used to being with, to use an example. So I opened the book by describing how, when I went to this, what I perceived to be, heard was an interracial church, the first Sunday I went there, I walk in thinking, I'm this liberal, wonderful, non-racist person coming here to, write a wonderful book or something. I walk in the room, and that Sunday it just happened that most of the people there were black. And I realized I felt uncomfortable. I mean, I became acutely aware of my whiteness, and I felt uncomfortable, which was embarrassing. And I realized that, and then I went on to do some more research, that there are these phenomenon called habituations, bodily habituation, racialized bodily habituations, where whites are used to being in the majority. So we can feel perfectly comfortable with a couple of, or two or three, black faculty or whatever in any kind of group, or a few bodies of color in our church. But and the example I'll use to illustrate this is this church had decided to become multiracial when it started out as a very small, new white church. And eventually, there was this event where an African preacher was brought. The first preacher was a white guy. An African preacher came, and more African friends of his came to the service. And one of the white families got really upset, and they said, the church is getting too black. Now, that's just another example of what it means to do what one of my African American colleagues called ownership of space. Because I described this event to him and I said, do you have a term for that? And he said, oh, sure, white ownership of space.
Yeah.
When too many of us, come in the room, you all feel uncomfortable.
In my book, Let the Bones Dance, I talk about how the kind of calcification of bodies in mainline Protestantism, the intellectualization of worship, are part of the ways that white supremacy are held intact in our worship forms, in our kind of governance of the church, in the skill sets that are valued, and in the music that we use, and in all the different ways that we really incorporate people into a community. And I pastored a multi-ethnic, multiracial church in California, and I saw the dynamics of this at work in very interesting ways, in the way that people were able to kind of, and not able to, welcome new people who brought different habits of worship, different ways of responding in worship. For instance, we had some Pentecostal folks come to worship with us one day, and they brought their tambourines and they said amen, and it was actually pretty awesome. I was preaching and it felt great. People not look half dead out there, responding to the worship, and really just taking up space in there with their whole selves. And after the service, one of our deacons came up to me and said, it's fine if they come, but they need to know how to act. That was disrespectful. And so her formation in the church was that to use your good manners in church was to be quiet, to be, still, to be moderated in your behavior, and certainly to not use your body like that. For her, it was about good manners. And to help people unpack that, you have to talk some about racialized biases and how these norms have come to be taken for granted as right versus an expression of a particular culture or an expression of a particular way of doing things. When for our Pentecostal brothers and sisters that came and worshiped with us that day, that was respectful. That's how they showed respect, is to say they're listening. I'm listening to you. I hear what you're saying. Preach, amen. And that was their ultimate way of showing respect. If they had been silent during the sermon, that would have been disrespectful from their formation. And so those are pretty obvious examples.
Okay. So we've had some definitions. We've seen this video. What's most alive for you right now? Take a moment, maybe taking a deep breath, scan your heart, soul, mind, strength. If you're feeling more alive in one area, that's fine. Take note of that. Then challenge yourself to go to another space. And we'll take a moment. Thank you for pausing and taking a moment. Feel free to share in the chat box what's happening with you in your heart, your soul, your mind, or your strength at this time. We will move into our Bible study.
Thanks, Rhonda. So when we were planning this, we got into a chat about lots of different call stories in scripture. We talked about Esther, and we talked about the disciples being called from their nets. And we talked about the call of Saul/Paul. There's Job, and his call to mourn. There's Esther and her call to risk. There's Jonah. All sorts of call stories. And whatever call story you're looking at is an invitation to step out of whatever is normal for you. Whatever is normal, everyday, interior surroundings, God is inviting you out. The interesting question, of course, is what happens when you don't respond to a divine invitation? And, as I read through these stories, it often gets a little uncomfortable. And, sometimes I've had conversation with my friends and with confirmation classes, you get a Holy Spirit nudge in the ribs, and then sometimes you end up with the Holy Spirit kick in the pants. And in the long run, you're better off going than not going when the Holy Spirit calls you out from the familiar. So Rhonda, why don't we keep going with this Bible study and see what's coming up next here. The call story we've actually used to shape this particular series that we're doing together is the call of Abram. I'm going to read this through a couple of times slowly. And what I'd like you to do is listen for what catches you. Where's your imagination captured? Where do you stop? And so if you need to jot down a note somewhere on your phone or on a piece of paper to help you remember, go for it. Just think about what catches you. Just take a moment to listen. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your land, your family, and your father's household for the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name respected and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you." Abram left just as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all of their possessions, and those who became members of their household in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as the sacred place at Shechem, at the oak of Moreh. Canaanites lived in the land at that time. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I give this land to your descendants." So Abram built an altar there to the Lord, who appeared to him. From there he traveled toward the mountains east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and worshiped in the Lord's name. Then Abram set out toward the arid southern plain, making and breaking camp. as he went. And a second time from Genesis chapter 12, the call of Abram. The Lord said to Abram, leave your land, your family, and your father's household for the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name respected, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you. Abram left just as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all of their possessions, and those who became members of their household in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as the sacred place at Shechem, at the oak of Moreh. The Canaans lived in the land at that time. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, I give this land to your descendants. So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. From there, he traveled toward the mountains east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and worshiped in the Lord's name. Then Abram set out toward the arid southern plain, making and breaking camp as he went. I wonder where your imagination was captured, where your mind stopped in that reading, and how that might reflect for you on the work before us. If you're by yourself, I would invite you to journal on it. If you're with a group, I would invite you to share that with the folks who are with you, to take some time sharing with one another. Now, we've also pulled some other call passages, and these passages are all also relevant to the work that we're doing. The call of Ruth and Naomi, the sending out of the 70 from Luke chapter 10, and the call of Saul/Paul, and interestingly enough, also a bit of a call to Ananias. Some themes to consider as you read through those. We go before we know how to do what we're doing. This isn't just about doing, but also about becoming. Something's happening to us. It's not just about what we're doing outside of us. God is calling us to invest in relationships as we're going out. And this work will have us grow self and community in uncomfortable ways. A couple of final notes on the Genesis 12 passage before we leave Bible study tonight. This passage is an absolutely critical one in the formation of God's people. It starts, leave your land, your family. The Hebrew is lech lecha. It's a huge emphasis. Go, exclamation points. Leave, go forth. Might as well say, get yourself going. The medieval commentators said the literal translation, go for yourself, that emphasis means it's not just for God's mission, that you're going to get a blessing out of this too. Rhonda, where do we go from here?
My mind, back on the text you read, it went to the making and breaking of camp.
Mm-hmm.
As he went along the way, that stuck out for me. And just thinking with that part, it's just it's a journey,
Right.
that it's not smooth all along the way.
Mm-mm.
Each time you might have to build up, tear down, build up, tear down, but you keep progressing, you keep going.
I think that's a great message.
Yeah, that's what stood out for me at the reading of the text.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, for those of you that are listening and joining us live, what did you hear? What called to you? And what is the blessing?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the blessing? So if you want to take a moment, journal it, or put something in the chat box, that's great. If you're watching the replay, take this as a moment to journal and consider what you think the blessing might be in your engagement, in the act of leaving, or the blessing in being called to something.
My favorite benediction as a pastor is to raise my hands and offer the words, "We are blessed to be a blessing to a congregation." And remembering that those things go hand in hand, that any privilege that we have is meant for the good of all. Any gifts that we have are meant to be shared.
Yeah. I really also appreciate these themes and considering this, especially we go before we know. In our future sessions, we will talk about white supremacy culture and some of the idols of white supremacy. I think part of this idea of going before we know how really bucks up against the idea of white supremacy, because that insists that we know everything. It insists that we have to know everything, that it has to be completely organized and put together, and it has to be perfect. But this first thing just totally throws that out the window. So go before we know, especially before we even know how. And that's that act of faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we've been called into by faith. And, you know, in the New Testament in Hebrews, Paul expounds on that tremendously. By faith, they did, listing all of these, you know, you could say extensive cost stories. That is the faith piece of us saying, yes, may not know every detail, but it is our faith that calls us to be able to say yes without the know-how. So that was another theme that resonated for me. that you introduced.
There's, our tradition is so rich in resources for anti-racist work. If we lean into it and trust it. So don't be afraid to dig into the texts and be reflective with them and contemplative with them to ground you for action.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, and grounding us to be able to be in relationships even when it's uncomfortable.
Yep.
So that's to your last point. That allows us to grow, that allows us to challenge, and that allows us to just keep moving forward, building up and breaking down, building up and breaking down all along that journey.
Yeah, I mean, we started off talking about deconstruction and building something new. And with Abram and Sarai's journey across the ancient Near East, this is what we see. Like, you're always making camp and breaking camp and making camp and breaking camp. That you're not settled anywhere. You're always going out, and you're going for God, you're going for yourself, and you're just trusting that God will.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Carrie, for sharing and grounding us in this biblical text and giving us something to hold on to as we continue this conversation about holy imagination, right? It's going to take a whole lot of that.
You got it.
To get us on our way to becoming that anti-racist church. So let's take another moment to check in with ourselves. What's most alive for you right now? Heart, soul, mind, strength. Where are you feeling this conversation tonight at in your body? Take a moment and pause. Either you journal. If you're with us live, you can put it in the chat box. We'll just sit here and take a minute with that. All right, thank you for taking that moment to check in with yourself, to challenge yourself, to move to a different part of the quadrants. Maybe you jumped in at the heart space. Hopefully you moved to a different area. Maybe you moved to your soul. If you jumped in at the mind space, maybe you really got in touch with your body. We want to keep pushing ourselves and challenging ourselves and asking ourselves to fully be present and aware. And we're going to do a video next, and hopefully you can hear it well. I encourage you to turn the volume up on your unit all the way if you are having some trouble listening. But this, along with our Bible study, this next video really sends us off into the direction of where we're going. It is putting that challenge right out there. So here goes.
And can you break down for us this difference between an ally, and a co-conspirator?
Yeah, so
I bet you can.
So, you know, the book is about like this idea of abolitionist teaching, right? And so, shout out to upstate New York. I'm from upstate New York. You know, we don't like New Yorkers, but that's okay. Yeah. 'Cause when you're from upstate New York, like, where are you from? You know, I'm from upstate. Queens? No. Brooklyn? No. Albany? No. I'm from upstate New York, Rochester, New York, 90 miles from Canada, right? And so, you know, so we had abolitionists in upstate New York. That's where I grew up. And the one thing about an abolitionist had to be a co-conspirator. I mean, I want y'all for a second to just think about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad freed over 100,000 enslaved Africans and black folks. Right? Think about this. There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram. This was all off trust and love of each other. And to say that this system of racism and bondage, no more.
Yeah.
We did that. It was everyday people. Farmers, bankers, doctors, teachers, nurses, all ethnicities. We did that as a country. Someone came to your door, gave you a code, you just had to trust them. And so I wanted to bring that back. What would it mean for us in 2019 to think about what it would mean to be an abolitionist and to be a co-conspirator? And in the book, I use James Tyson. Now, many people are not familiar with who James Tyson is. You know Bree Newsom. Bree Newsom was the young black woman who took that Confederate flag down in South Carolina 8 days after Dylann Roof went into the AME church. And I tell the story in the book because I think this is an important story because Bree Newsom and James Tyson did not know each other. There were some folks who got together and said that flag is coming down. They said, and a black woman's gonna take it down. They taught Bree how to climb. They had Bree's bail money ready. And that morning, Bree Newsom and James Tyson were at an IHOP. They got the word, come take the flag down. Bree Newsom climbs up on the pole to take the flag down. Now, this is where the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator is. James Tyson, now there's a gate for the flagpole. James Tyson isn't standing like outside the gate. Okay, like, Bree, they coming, Bree. Hey, Bree. No, James Tyson, he is inside. And then the police say, you know what? We can get her down. Tase the pole. James Tyson, because he wasn't here, he was here, said, okay. He put his hand on the pole. That white man at that moment understood why he was there. He put his hand on the pole, and he knew that the police would not tase that pole with a white man, healthy white man, right there. He saved her life. That's what it means to be an ally. You can stand out there, and allies know all the language. They read all the books. They come to the meeting with all the terms. Right? They read the report before you read the report. Right? I always say allies make black folks feel bad. Like, did you read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book? Like, damn, I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book. Like, you know, I've been busy being black. Right? So I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book, but I know it's fire. Right? So they come and they know everything and they good. And then after the meeting, you're like, well, what we gonna do? They go, you're like, oh, they left already? Where'd they go?
I'm gonna call it Uber.
I'm gonna call it Uber, right? So that's the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator. You know, and this is that back to that abolitionist, is to put something on the line for somebody.
Yeah.
Take a risk to see how to use your whiteness. And I tell folks all the time, whiteness is like a bank. And it just, your ATM card just replenishes itself. So spend it. As the kids say, cash out. Right, cash out. It's gonna come right back. And so to be a co-conspirator, I I try to write in the book is to take risks for somebody, to put
Yeah.
something on the line, but to use it in a way in which where you're using your privilege.
Yeah.
Yes. Use it. And I'm not just talking about white folks, I'm talking about cisgender folks. Use it for trans folks. Like, use it for queer folks.
Yeah.
Like, put something on the line. Take a risk. It doesn't have to be small risk, big risk. James Tyson simply said here, put his hand on the pole. That's it. And that's what we are talking about with co-conspirators. Allies, they know everything, they can say, they can talk it. But when it's time, they're not there. And if they're there, they're looking at you like, you going? Oh, you going. You go on the front lines, right? Black folks and brown folks, we don't want to fight racism. The Creator did not put me here to fight racism.
Yeah.
If you believe that, that's racist. I should be here and be in my full life and be my full self and my full human.
Yes.
But I gotta fight what y'all created. So they gotta come to the table with something more than just I read the new book.
Right.
Right? Take a risk.
So having heard that definition, you didn't know I was.
I love that video.
Mm-hmm.
It is a powerful, powerful video, which reminds us to get involved and get engaged into the action of dismantling white supremacy. And that's the invitation that we have for you all this evening. As we thought about our courses each week, we labeled them, and we labeled this one the invitation to become an accomplice. And so we're going to take in this moment now to invite you to really think about, what does it mean for you to become an accomplice in dismantling white supremacy as it shows up in your congregation, in your church conference, in your judicatory, within your denomination, your seminaries, colleges, schools, print books. What does it mean for you to become an accomplice in dismantling white supremacy? Not only that, and thinking about our Bible study, we find that there is a blessing, right? When we choose to step out, go out before we know it all, it's a blessing when you accept this invitation. How does this blessing show up in your home, in your churches, in your community? I want you to think about that with me for a second. What's the blessing in accepting this invitation? To leave the familiar place of white supremacy and become an accomplice in actually dismantling it. How does that benefit Christian churches across the United States, Christian churches right here in our own communities, Sunday schools, vacation Bible studies, or vacation Bible school, small group studies, your councils? Carrie, you have any further thoughts on that?
You know, I think for me, my experience as somebody who has grown up in predominantly white churches and has started taking this journey. I've worked as a local church pastor. I work professionally now with judicatories, so regional church bodies, if you're not familiar with that term, and with churches across an entire state. I think I've seen the reality of white supremacy in the church in lots of different ways. The invitation to get involved for lots of different reasons, individuals, pastoral care, pain that people I know and love are experiencing, and being able to imagine that multiplied out over all the people I don't yet know, right? And the need for this to stop happening. I went to a rally in Washington, D.C. on the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And people came from all over the United States. And I remember Bishop Darren Moore from one of the member denominations of the National Council of Churches bringing his grandbaby up there and saying, I'm doing this so in another 50 years, he won't have to march to end racism. We shouldn't have to keep doing this. The reality is we have to keep doing this. And we can't stop. We have to be serious about it. There need to be more allies and accomplices and more people working towards abolition.
Yeah, we have to put something on the line, as was shared in that previous video. And that's what I enjoy so much from that video presentation, and that it reminds us that is much more required of us, that it could even possibly be our own safety, even our own lives. That as we move towards this work of dismantling white supremacy within Christianity, and especially in our churches, where we have stained glass windows with white Jesus and white disciples. As you shared the story earlier about the looking for an appropriate or even just a racially diverse Advent. It is really important for us to step into that place of saying, as people of faith, what are we going to put on the line? And so I want you to think about that as we move forward into next week, our future sessions. We want to encourage you to go to these stories. You can either reread the text that we shared before. If you are following this and you're watching this on the replay, feel free. You can easily write this down and go through each of these stories. Otherwise, if you're joining us live, we will make sure we email these stories to you and the instruction alongside it. We want you to go through each passage and read it, as was demonstrated before, twice and slowly, and really listen for what catches your imagination. What is that that's making you stop and reflect, and what might the Spirit be saying to you, and how might the Spirit be calling you from the familiar and calling you into this deeper place of really being an accomplice in the fight against white supremacy and moving this church, especially our Christian church here in the United States, into being that anti-racist church. And we would love to hear your reflections when we meet next week. Did you want to share anything else about this?
I think one invitation might be to find somebody else to do this work with. If you've decided to try this on your own, one possibility might be to invite a friend or a fellow parishioner into this reading. And or pastors, is there someone on your pastor parish relations committee who would do this with you, or a colleague, and do the reading together and share with one another what caught your imagination, made you stop, and be able to paraphrase for one another what you heard. There's a lot of growth in sharing learning together. If you're not able to do that, then I'd encourage you to actually take the time to journal either in words or art. So that way you're not just doing it in passing, but you're taking the time to integrate it with your body as well as your mind.
Yeah, I love those suggestions. Thank you. Again, go back to the quadrant and think about anything else that comes up for you. Again, as you read the text, you may want to go through that. What's happening for me in my heart right now? What's going on? What questions are coming up for me? How is this playing with what I thought I knew about what God was calling me to do before, what I was learning before, maybe through sermon series or Bible studies, and how is this new information bumping up against some of your own theology? And then where are you feeling it in your body? And what actions might you be called to take? And with that, just take note of the invitation to become an accomplice in this fight against white supremacy. Pay attention to how and where you are being invited to be brave. Look for examples of white privilege and white supremacy in the church and in Christianity in general. As we gather next week, we'll talk more about the various forms of white supremacy and how those show up. So we look forward to engaging the information that you have to share with us, and sign up for the next class. We'll send you the information to do that. We look forward to having you join us and keep pushing forward. And I do want to encourage you to, like we said earlier, this is the time for you to stay engaged and to speak your truth and assess yourself. You know where you're at, where you came to this study at. Perhaps you came in as an actor and you want to push yourself to that next space of really becoming an ally. Maybe you've been in the ally space and you feel like, okay, it's time for me to really put something on the line and become an accomplice. Perhaps you feel like, hey, I've been risking it all for a while, and I see that it's really time to tear down all the various systems of oppression, and you really want to move into that space of advocacy and becoming an abolitionist. That's fine. You assess yourself as we go along in this and be as honest with yourself as possible, because that's how we're going to get to where we need to get to. That's you showing up as a whole person, engaging yourself on every level and being honest with yourself at every level. And as Carrie mentioned earlier, that sometimes the Holy Spirit elbows you in the ribs with a message. Hopefully you allow yourself to hear it. So we thank you for joining us this evening and giving us your time and attention tonight. It's been great. The fastest hour and a half I've been a part of. With that, I'll let you, Carrie, give us our final good night.
Again, we would love to have you back for the rest of the series. We've got a total of 6 sessions planned and an opportunity for you to work on your own plans for your own context, for what you intend to do. So I'm really grateful to my colleague Rhonda for her expertise and her sharing, her personal generosity, and her partnership in this work. I'm grateful to you for taking the time to get an introduction to it, and we hope to see you again. Take care. God bless. We invite you to take on the homework and stretch yourself until we see you again.
Until we see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.